Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for an MP webinar covering payroll fraud, key steps for prevention and identification in 2023. I'm Katie Kreider, Marketing Specialist here at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company. We offer a complete suite of products and services to support organizations through the entire employee lifecycle, including recruiting, HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service, and a deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help our clients succeed by aligning their people strategy with their business goals. I'm excited to introduce your presenter for today's program, Paul Carelis. Paul has over a decade of experience in the HR consulting space, working with businesses of all sizes and industries. Paul leads a team of SHRM-certified HR professionals at MP. Together, they assist clients with compliance, training, and HR guidance and support for the full employee lifecycle. Paul also spearheads MP's employee retention tax credit services, and this initiative has helped thousands of clients claim over $100 million in refundable advanceable tax credit. And just a few housekeeping issues before we get started here today. If you would like to submit a question during the program, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We will be sending out the recording of the webinar later today along with the slides. And with all of that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Paul.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. Looking forward to diving into a new topic this afternoon. Definitely an important and timely one, but we will get on to all that shortly. So before we get started, just a quick note, this presentation is from a HR best practices standpoint. Hopefully you'll get a lot out of today's session and have some new considerations and some things you hadn't been thinking about. Please do not construe anything today as legal advice. So in terms of what we will cover, we'll go over some quick statistics to kind of see what we're dealing with when it comes to payroll fraud in the workplace. We'll discuss the different types of fraud, both internal payroll fraud as well as external threats that can lead to fraudulent activity. We'll talk about what steps you can take as a business to inspect your payroll function as well as prevent fraud as much as possible. It's not something that can be completely prevented, but it is something that can be caught and remedied. And then, as always, we'll save some time for any questions that you may have, and we'll do our best to answer those before the end of today's webinar. All right, so let's take a quick look at some data. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners did a study, and these numbers are before the COVID-19 pandemic. So and I understand there's another in-depth study going on right now, and those results have not yet been released. But just based on my experience, and we'll talk about my personal experience with payroll fraud in today's session, but just in terms of what we're seeing and working with clients and what we're seeing in terms of threats posed to us here at MP, I would definitely say that these numbers are probably higher than what this study shows. But at the time of this study, 27% of businesses are subject to some form of payroll fraud each year, including 14% of small companies defined as businesses with under 100 employees. Oops, sorry for the typo there. In terms of fraud incidents, the average length of a fraud instance is 36 months. So 3 years, in most cases, once fraud is caught, that it's actually been going on for several years, which adds to the financial damages for sure. And we'll get into a recent story about this, one that went on for quite a bit longer than that. And then the average or median cost of a payroll fraud incident is approximately $62,000. So very expensive, especially if you have multiple instances of fraud. Those can add up very, very quickly. So in terms of some stories of payroll fraud, and again, this is becoming so prevalent, I'm going to talk about 3 different stories that I recently read about. And these are all from within the last 30 days in terms of hitting the news cycle. So as you can imagine, if you look back several months, you'll see countless stories of payroll fraud. And again, these are just the ones that made it to the news for one reason or another. There may have been an arrest. There may have been, it may have been a famous or popular brand or company. The employee may be facing jail time or prison or other litigation. So these are the ones that made the mainstream media. As you can imagine, there are countless others that go on at businesses across the country each and every day that don't make it to the news. So this is really becoming more and more prevalent. One of the stories that grabbed quite a bit of headlines didn't actually occur here in the US. This was in Canada, but there was a Canadian CPA firm who had terminated an employee. The employee sued them for kind of the Canadian equivalent of wrongful termination. But as part of their due diligence, the employer had been utilizing some software called TimeCamp, where they were able to look at the different projects that she had associated time to and the way that she had allocated her time to different clients and client projects. And when they compared her time records to what the software showed in terms of what work she had actually done, there were several of these companies where she hadn't performed any work. She had been doing work on the side, been spending working hours doing things not related to the CPA firm. And based on the law there in Canada and the findings and her admittance of guilt, the employee was ordered to pay nearly $2,500 in damages to the employer for falsifying her time records. So how that would fly here in the US, somewhat unknown. We'll get into the Department of Labor's rules for compensable time shortly, but that was one recent case. Another one was significantly more financial impact was at the Chicago Institute of Art. So earlier this year, it came in the news, but it was discovered late last year. The payroll manager at the Chicago Institute of Art, over a 13-year period, had diverted and transferred over $2 million to himself. So how he did it was, allegedly, he had reclassified some payments. He had called them tuition reimbursement, tax offsets, advances in pay to employees and former employees, but then had those rerouted into his personal bank account. So in terms of the charges against him, he is facing the chance of having to pay back $2.3 million plus additional damages back to the Chicago Institute of Art. And he's being charged with 4 different felonies that add up to, if he's fully convicted, could put him in jail for up to 100 years. So again, a very, very serious crime. And then another story from the last 30 days is at a business called Atlantic Health Systems in New Jersey. So this is what's called a ghost employee, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But there was a supervisor who had access to their payroll system, had the ability to add employees, issue payments. So what she allegedly did was added 2 of her friends to the Atlantic Health System payroll who weren't actually employees of Atlantic Health System, and then collectively paid them over $71,000. They then allegedly split the money between the 3 of them. So they're facing charges as well. And then on the other side of the coin, a small payroll company in Missouri was just indicted for allegedly embezzling $1.5 million in client payroll funds. So they're essentially collecting taxes on behalf of the clients. They then did some fraudulent SBA lending and were offsetting the loan payments with the embezzled client fund. So it's a big fraudulent mess, still being sorted out by the courts, but just another example of something to be mindful of as you do business and looking at both internal and external threats. So what are the various types of payroll fraud? So we'll kind of break this down into the internal versus the external. Again, the stuff that we cover are kind of the most common things that we're seeing today, but people, especially people with devious thoughts and people who either need money or are greedy or desperate, they'll pull out all kinds of stops. So especially when it comes to the hacking piece, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the list that we go over today, by the end of 2023, there'll probably be new things to add to it. People are getting very creative and very tricky, and it's becoming more and more difficult for businesses and business owners and decision makers to really mitigate their fraud risk. So at the employee level, some of the things that we'll commonly see will be falsification of time cards or timesheets. So people putting in hours that they didn't actually work, adding overtime, otherwise just not being honest or truthful on their timekeeping records. Obviously, a proliferation of this as people are working remotely. So it was a little bit easier to nab when all of someone's hours were being performed in the office or at the work site. But with people working from their own homes or other remote locations, it's a lot more difficult to monitor. So we're seeing a lot more of this. Also unauthorized hours. So the employees may be actually doing some work, or doing certain things that are work related, maybe not what you'd want them to be doing, but really just kind of padding their paycheck. So technically speaking, we'll talk about this in the compliance corner down at the bottom. It may be something where you do have to pay. It's not necessarily fraud in the sense where if you get someone caught, you can collect back those payments. They may legitimately be working compensable time, but they weren't given permission to, and they're just racking up overtime, doing minimal work or doing work that you otherwise didn't want them to do because of the cost. So that's another separate concern. Also see a lot of bonus and commission schemes. So that might be people putting in sales in a fraudulent or unethical manner, or kind of tricking the system so that they achieve certain commission levels or commission percentages. A lot of abuse of bonus and commission schemes. In environments where a physical or virtual time clock is used, many incidents where buddy punching occurs. So that's basically, I'm not actually performing work, but the person who I'm in cahoots with is punching in for themselves at the start of their shift and also punching me in for the start of the shift. So I'm accumulating payroll hours during that time when I'm not actually working. Might be an instance where someone's running late and they're punching them in on time, or coming back late from lunch and being punched in by someone else. So just rife for fraud there. We also see abuses of expenses, reimbursements, mileage, just people being dishonest there, putting in for reimbursements that are either more than the actual expense that was suffered by the employee, or expensing things not work related or things that wouldn't otherwise be approved, just knowing that the auditing or the reviewing of those expenses is lax and they can put it in and get paid on it. Also, businesses also run the risk of employees abusing some of the various leave programs that are out there. This is something that, as an employer, you need to tread very lightly on. There are many protections in place with many of these laws for employees, things like earned sick time and all of that, where you don't want to accuse someone of abusing it unless you have some really reasonable suspicions. So you got to be careful here, but for lengthier leaves of absence, things under the FMLA program, Family Medical Leave Act, or other, workers' comp, there can often be fraudulence there. When it comes to workers' comp, my recommendation is really lean on your workers' comp provider. They don't want to pay out a fraudulent claim any more than you do. So if you do have concerns or someone's come to you as a whistleblower, definitely pass that along to the workers' comp company, and in most cases they'll conduct the investigation or look into it further. A little bit trickier when it comes to FMLA leave and things like that, where you're not working with a third party who's managing it or approving or denying the leave. So again, you want to be careful there with your accusations. You want to handle it very delicately. I'll say, if you do suspect that there may be fraudulent activity going on with an FMLA claim or some other type of approved leave of absence, definitely talk to an HR professional, such as the ones here at MP. We can kind of walk through the process to make sure you do it compliantly, that you don't unnecessarily expose yourself and be the person getting yourselves in trouble and getting the company fined or penalized when you're really just trying to reduce expenses due to what you suspect to be fraudulent activity. It's just, you got to handle that very, very delicately and within the letters of the law and the rights awarded to the employees versus the rights awarded to employers with these things. So make sure you talk that through with a certified HR professional before you proceed with your concerns about fraudulent activity on leaves of absence. And then in terms of the HR compliance corner here, so this is really important when it comes to U.S. employment law and when there's fraudulent activity. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is governed by the Department of Labor, states that whenever an employee is suffered or permitted to work, that time is considered compensable. So they have to be paid for that time. So harking back to the second bullet point there, if someone is working unauthorized hours, they still need to be paid. It can certainly be a disciplinary situation. You can counsel them, you can write them up, you could even terminate them. But at the end of the day, they need to be paid for those hours that they worked. So if you're allowing people to work from home, you should set, and they're non-exempt, meaning they're paid by the hour. You should really set some strict guidelines and boundaries in terms of when you allow them to do email or take and receive phone calls, because unless it's really, really nominal and the bar for that is very low, maybe listening to a voicemail or something that's only going to take a minute or two, if they're doing actual work, they need to be paid for it. So sometimes you might have a worker who isn't a problem, they're non-exempt, they're going to get the job done and you appreciate that, but you've kind of looked the other way as they've worked more and more hours and it may or may not be showing up on their timesheets. But again, things can happen. Maybe their spouse loses their job and they're in a financial pickle all of a sudden, or they get passed up for a promotion and they're really upset by it, or whatever the reason may be. They might start to think back to all those extra hours that they worked and they weren't paid, and all of a sudden want payment for it, and in most cases be within their rights to claim that. So just be very careful, especially when it comes to that remote work, that you're setting clear boundaries and expectations about what you're allowing for work, and monitor it to some extent too. In some instances, you can say you weren't aware that the employee was working, but if you're getting CC'd on emails after hours or otherwise are privy to information and can see that the work is being performed outside of the normal work schedule, the courts are generally going to say that you knew or should have known that that work was being performed and that you were allowing it. All right, then over on the supervisory or manager level, and this is why it's really important to be mindful of who you give access to your systems and what level of access they receive. So as the example we talked about for that healthcare company in New Jersey, ghost employees are certainly a problem. If you're not keeping a careful eye on your payroll records, it's very easy for someone who has appropriate access to create an employee, either pay that person or have it going to their personal bank account. That's what we saw was the payment redirection with that case at the Chicago Museum of Art, where they might set up a secondary direct deposit for somebody or an expense reimbursement for somebody, but then have that money going to them. We also see cases of pay rates being altered, either up or down, in a fraudulent manner. So that's something to be mindful of. You might not catch it if you're only checking the hours worked, but if the pay rate is being inflated, that can result in fraudulent money going to an employee. And then another thing we don't always think of as payroll fraud, but when you examine the statistics and the official definitions, one thing that is considered employment and payroll fraud is when a worker is misclassified. So that would be when someone's being paid as an independent contractor when, based on the laws either in that state or at the federal level, indicate that they should be a W-2 employee. So the government considers that payroll fraud because you are not paying the mandatory employment taxes or withholdings for that individual. There may also be other benefits that they're entitled to, depending on what state they're in. That could be earned sick time or paid family medical leave. It could be parental leave or maternity leave, other protections that employees get that independent contractors don't necessarily. So from an employer standpoint, an employer can also be guilty of payroll fraud if they're not correctly classifying their workers. So in terms of external payroll fraud, and again, we're seeing a large spike of this anecdotally at least, and I'm sure when the next in-depth study and survey comes out on payroll fraud, there's going to be a big spike in this area. One of the most common ways we're currently seeing hackers and criminals try to gain access or try to defraud businesses or individuals is through email spoofing. So sending out an email, pretending to be or gaining access to someone's email account and sending out an email to their employer or to other people who have some sort of ability to change bank accounts and things like that, where they send an email to me and say, hey, Paul, please change my direct deposit. Here's the bank account that it should go to going forward. The authorized individual then makes that change. And all of a sudden you hear from the employee, hey, why didn't I get paid this week? And we look into it and we realize that they didn't actually send that email. And it was someone acting fraudulently, and that money is now gone. So a ton around that with direct deposit changes, something to be very mindful of, and we'll talk about some ideas for how to mitigate that momentarily. Unemployment fraud. So this is the instance of payroll fraud that I was a victim of. So this dates back to 2020. We were kind of in the throes of the pandemic. Here at MP, we were very, very busy, especially on the HR side, consulting businesses, helping them get their PPP loans and advising them on retention credits and helping them develop policies for how to maintain a COVID-free workplace and what they were allowed to do in terms of and what they were required to do to be compliant with OSHA and CDC and all of that. So keeping very, very busy. And in the midst of that, one day I got a call from our HR manager saying, this is going to sound like a really funny question, but you didn't file for unemployment by any chance, did you? And obviously I hadn't. But what had happened, and this became a nationwide kind of crisis for a while, and it's still going on to a lesser extent, but still happening. So some fraudulent folks, they believe actually outside of the country, gained some personal data of individuals from retailers' data breaches, and then use that information to apply for unemployment in several states. So for employers who weren't maintaining or checking their unemployment claims, and many weren't just because there were a lot of furloughs and layoffs and legitimate unemployment claims. A lot of these were slipping through the cracks, and these fraudsters were collecting large sums of unemployment compensation from these state programs completely fraudulently. So, and again, that's something that's still going on now. So something you need to be vigilant about. Aside from emails and changing employees' direct deposits, there's also kind of the greater risk of accidentally breaching your system. So either your payroll system, your accounting system, or any other system that you're using that contains sensitive employee or payroll data. So just like when someone's email is compromised, or even their Facebook or their Instagram is compromised, a lot of these hackers are advanced and know questions to ask and are able to make things look official. And you could find yourself accidentally giving away your password to one of these people, and then all of a sudden they have full access to your payroll system. They can run payrolls, they can put themselves on the payroll, they can do all kinds of damage, gain your bank account information. Really a true nightmare scenario. So you want to make sure that your staff is really fully trained and battle tested to avoid these scenarios where they may unintentionally give access to your systems to criminals. And then there's also the risk of a data breach. So again, accidentally sharing personally identifiable information via unsecured methods. Other third parties that you work with can also be involved in this. Again, the payroll company we talked about earlier, embezzling taxes, or a payroll company could have a data breach as well and accidentally share information of a client or their employees, or unintentionally give access to someone with bad intentions. So all kinds of fraud risks out there that we need to be mindful of. So before we get into the steps to take to mitigate, here are some signs you can kind of look for. aside from the proactive measures you can be taking. If you notice uncharacteristic spikes in your bank account debits or credits, if your payroll is generally pretty similar from pay period to pay period, but all of a sudden you're seeing some weird activity in there, that's definitely going to set off a red flag and signal a time to do some closer inspection. Also look for some dramatic changes in employee behavior, and really this could be any number of things that would or should concern you. It could be a mental health issue. It could be employees are retention risk. All of a sudden they're unhappy. It could be any number of things, but fraud is also a possibility there. So if an employee's seems to have a very different demeanor, might be something to take a closer look at. Also, if they're all of a sudden living extravagantly, buying luxury cars, otherwise seemingly living beyond their means, you might want to take a look at payroll activity, make sure there's nothing funny going on there. Also, and this especially goes for people that have access to your systems or are responsible for the payroll function, if those workers, and it sounds nice in theory, they never take any vacation time, never take any PTO, they want to do the work all themselves, they're hesitant to give out or delegate responsibilities or duties. As nice as that is, and as good it is to be able to count on someone to take all of the work on, you want to be looking at that through a critical lens as well. That could potentially be a sign that something's fishy is going on, because those employees that are cooking the books or doing something fraudulent or doing something deceitful, they may be inclined to not want to take any time off because their concern will be that someone will see what they're doing or discover what they're doing. Same goes for having other people involved in the payroll process. Once they have a set of eyes on it, they might notice that something isn't right or is fraudulent. So if you see someone very defensive about taking time off or not wanting to give others access to the system, that might be something you want to take a closer look at as well. You also want to, if you're starting to receive unusual tax notices, taxes going unpaid, something's out of cycle, again, that stuff happens. It's not necessarily meaning that anyone's being fraudulent, but just something to examine and put in the greater context of some of these other bullet points as well. So what are some steps you can take to mitigate? Again, there's nothing you can do to 100% guarantee that someone isn't going to attempt fraud against you, or that you may be the victim of some sort of fraud. Humans are independent thinkers. As much as you trust someone, they could surprise you. So it's really how do you check and how do you handle it to reduce and bring that down? Again, the average fraud incident goes on for 3 years. So let's try to keep that much shorter than that if it does occur. So first thing you can do is definitely consider reference and background checks based on department or responsibility. So this isn't to say if you don't do it now, you need to do background checks on everyone at your business. But some people think it's an all or nothing, and you certainly don't want to be discriminatory. You don't want to say, hey, we're just going to do background checks on all the men, but not the women, or all the people of this ethnicity, but not that ethnicity. That's obviously a big bias issue, but you are allowed to pick and choose when it comes to department or responsibility. So, if you want to say all the people in the finance department or the accounting department or the payroll department are going to be subject to background checks, that's generally okay. You can make a business case for why that makes sense. If people aren't going to have access to money or the bank accounts or the payroll, and you may not be otherwise concerned, then you can limit your background check policy to those folks that do have that level of access. That's completely fine and might be a good idea, just in case you see someone who's been convicted of fraud or wire fraud or any other number of financial crimes. That might not be someone you want working in that department. You want to make sure you've implemented an advanced payroll system. So these have come a long way with many companies, MP being one of them, but at a bare minimum, make sure that the system you're using is password protected, that it's got encryption technology, that you have access, or at least through the company are able to get your hands on a change in audit log. So if someone does make a change to someone's rate of pay or their bank account, that the system is able to go back and see who made that change and when. You also want to make sure that the system you're using has a robust reporting functionality to really help with any proactive payroll audit you're going to do, and we'll talk about that in a second. If you do use a physical time clock or other timekeeping system, you may want to consider upgrading that if buddy punching, especially if buddy punching is a concern. So there are some really advanced systems now, including those that use biometrics or a fingerprint to punch in and out. That obviously makes buddy punching immensely more difficult. You also, again, similar to the payroll functionality, want to make sure that your timekeeping system is able to produce an audit trail. So, if you are concerned about buddy punching, you can see that, hey, every time this one person punched in, 2 seconds later, this other person always punched in too. So that may be a sign of buddy punching going on. So some other steps to take: split up the tasks and responsibilities when it comes to your payroll function. So either having a backup who's authorized and filling in, splitting up the duties between a couple people within the department or within a couple departments, just so you don't have a single point of failure. So if God forbid that person gets hit by a bus, payroll can still be processed, but also just to keep that person in line and make sure that if you do have a bad actor, that there's going to be someone else in there in the system that will hopefully pick up on it. You also want to have some sort of checks and balances in place. So again, whether it's having multiple people in the system responsible for payroll, or otherwise having certain threshold limits, so that if someone is paid more than a certain amount, or if payroll exceeds a certain dollar amount, that shoots off a red flag. In many systems, you can also set up an approval process. So if a bank account is changed, that it has to be approved by someone with administrator level access. Speaking of that, especially now where there's just so many countless clients, and I've seen clients fall victim to this and actually change the bank accounts for employees and have them defrauded. I highly recommend requiring phone and or voice confirmation of direct deposit changes. So if you get an email from someone saying, hey, I want to change my direct deposit account to XYZ, make it your policy and your protocol and your requirements at the company level that whoever receives that request or whoever is responsible for processing it, if it's an office setting, walks over to that employee or otherwise picks up the phone and calls them and talks to them live and make sure that they did make that request for a direct deposit change. That can really help reduce or eliminate the risk of that email fraud going on right now. You can also have them utilize a specific direct deposit form. That can sometimes help cut it down, but the voice or phone confirmation is a little bit more foolproof. You also want to create easy ways for your employees to report suspected fraud. So that might be a hotline, it might be a reporting tool, it might just be speaking to them at a company meeting or a training or at onboarding to say, hey, if you ever are suspecting any type of fraud, payroll fraud, unethical behavior, please report it to whomever you designate at the company. It's not on here, but it's also really great if you can invest in some cybersecurity and fraud training. Many great programs out there, including LMS options. We have some here at MP. But the more that you can educate your staff on what to look out for and what some red flags and what some signs are that they should be mindful of, and really train them to be vigilant, and maybe even do some kind of testing, send out an email that could be fraudulent and see who clicks on the link, things like that. You want to make sure your staff is really well trained in the areas of fraud and data security. You also want to have a regular cycle of auditing your payroll records, and we'll go over a step-by-step process before we go on that. And then make sure you're reviewing all your mail-in notices. So whether that's unemployment claims, tax notices, correspondence from your payroll company, whatever it is, don't just shove that off into the tax bin or the tax file. Take a look at it. Read it through, make sure it makes sense, make sure there isn't anything suspicious in there. And then lastly, make sure you evaluate whom you choose for payroll. Whether that's us here at MP, we'd love your business if we don't have it already. But even if you use someone else, just make sure you're properly vetting them out. Some high-level things you want to be sure of. Make sure they have liability coverage. Don't be afraid to ask for references, especially if you're switching providers. See if they conduct a SOC audit. So a SOC audit examines a company's checks and balances and their systems to prevent fraud and keep data secure. You want to get an idea for what their data protection measures are. Do they operate in multiple states? How long have they been in business? And what's their, how do they comply with SEC regulations? All right, and finally, just kind of want to quickly go over a basic guide, and your process may look different or may be amended to best suit your needs, but some tips and tricks for conducting a successful payroll audit. So the first thing to do is just take a look at each employee, and again, this may or may not be scalable, this depending on the size of your organization. Some things to review: take a look at their rate of pay, make sure that that's correct. Take a look at hours worked over the most recent time period since the last audit. Are there any weird inconsistencies there? Is there a spike? Is it justified that they just have a busy time and they work some overtime, or is there something potentially fraudulent going on there? Review their deductions and reimbursements. Make sure that all looks sound. One other thing, and sometimes it requires a more watchful eye, but something that some experts recommend is look for matches with bank accounts or addresses. So obviously normal if a husband and wife or child and parent work for the same company, that their address might be the same, or they might be using the same bank account. But if you see multiple employees with the same address or same bank account, there could potentially be something fraudulent going on there. You then want to verify the commissions and the bonuses, compare them to the plan, compare them to the data supporting them earning the commission or the bonus, and then confirm the payout as well. You want to take a look and see, were there any special payroll runs? Were there any runs that were outside of the normal period? If you run bi-weekly, was there a payroll run in between one of those bi-weekly pay periods? If so, why? And what was it all about? Reconcile your payroll financials with your general ledger and your accounting software and make sure those all match up perfectly. Review your tax filings and your tax liabilities report that you get from your payroll provider. So make sure that at the end of the quarter, your quarter end reports from your final payroll of that quarter match up with what's being filed on the 941s and the other relevant payroll tax forms. And then examine your payroll process. Look for potential exposures and also look for efficiencies to make life easier for those within your organization that are responsible for payroll. So time reporting. How are people submitting their time? Are they punching in and out? Are they submitting time cards? Are they submitting time sheets? Can that be done virtually? What software are you utilizing to capture that time or measure efficiency or make sure that people are working the hours that they say they are? And then definitely audit who your authorized users are and what role they have or what level of access they have. So way too often we see people who have been demoted or laid off or terminated who still have access to the payroll system. So you want to make sure that when someone leaves, when they otherwise should be losing that access is terminated at the system level, and that doesn't create any unnecessary exposure for your business. And then finally, it's also always a good idea to conduct an HR audit, especially one that's centered around wage and hour compliance. So it's something we do with our clients in HR services, but whoever it's with, some things to examine. You want to take a look at your exempt and non-exempt employee classifications. Make sure that your exempt workers meet the salary basis test as well as the job duties test. There will be some changes to that coming in May from the federal government, so keep your eyes peeled there. If you do utilize and pay independent contractors, just make sure that those individuals meet the test in your state or at the federal level to truly be independent contractors, and that they shouldn't be paid as W-2 employees. Also make sure that you're paying overtime when hours worked in a week exceed 40, and also make sure that you're paying overtime at the correct rate. So it's a conversation for another day, and certainly send us questions you may have and we can get back to you on those. But an overtime rate isn't necessarily just 1.5 times their normal hourly rate. When it comes to certain bonuses and commissions and other incentive pay, those oftentimes have to be computed as part of the regular rate and factored in when an employee works overtime. So make sure you're not only paying overtime, but you're paying overtime at the correct regular rate. As we just saw a business a few months ago get hit with a really nasty DOL fine and penalty for not paying overtime at the regular rate. Make sure you're following state compliance. So especially as businesses have moved to a remote workforce, you need to make sure that you're in compliance with all the wage and hour rules wherever those employees are working. So, if you're sitting in Massachusetts, but you've got employees working remotely in New York and Connecticut and California, you are an employer in those three states, and you need to make sure that your pay practices for those employees there are compliant. So make sure you're taking a look at the full state-by-state picture as a multi-state employer. Make sure you're meeting minimum wage requirements. Several states increased their minimum wage this year, as well as any premium pay requirements in these states, whether that be for Sunday or holiday pay. Also make sure you're observing meal and rest breaks. So make sure that in the state you're in, you know what the meal break rules are, that those are being followed, and ideally that those are being reflected in your record keeping. So if someone argues that they weren't getting their meal breaks, you have proof that they were. And also take a look at your personnel files. Make sure you've got the correct W-4 forms, any other payroll, withholding, tax forms, that you have those and that they're up to date and accurate. All right, so hopefully that gave you some things to look out for, some ideas of how to tackle payroll compliance and hopefully be as audit-proof as possible as a business going forward. I thank you for your time, and I'll hand things back over to Katie.
Thanks, Paul. To learn more about MP's full service HR solutions for 2023 and more, I did drop a link earlier into the chat that will connect you with an MP team member or take you to the MP website. You can visit our website for more information about MP and our solutions. Be sure to join us next week on the same day and time for our upcoming webinar, Quiet Quitting and Quiet Firing. What should managers know? Visit our website to register and to see the full calendar of upcoming events and available resources. We will be sending out the recording of today's webinar along with the presentation slides this afternoon. Thanks for joining us and have a terrific day.